So a major new Second Amendment decision just dropped, and it is likely going to change how magazine bans are now viewed going forward. And this has huge implications for a lot of things that are currently going on when it comes to magazines, and current Supreme Court review also of another magazine ban that is pending in front of them. A court has now ruled that bans on magazines holding more than 10 rounds does in fact violate the Second Amendment. And what makes this decision so important is that it directly conflicts with other major appellate court rulings that upheld also these types of bans. So in other words, courts are now reaching opposite conclusions about the Constitution, and that creates what we call a circuit split. And when that happens, it dramatically increases the chances that the Supreme Court will need to step in to resolve this issue. And that means because currently we have the Duncan versus Bonta case, which deals with California magazine bans pending in front of the Supreme Court, this increases the chance that the Supreme Court will have to review that case or a similar magazine ban case eventually down the road. So let's break down what happened in this decision and where this may play out now going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, the ruling we're going to be talking about in this video comes out of Washington, D.C., and it's a case called Benson versus the United States. This case started after police officers stopped a man named Tyree Benson and found him carrying a firearm with a standard capacity magazine. Now, because DC bans magazines holding more than 10 rounds, Benson was charged with several crimes, including possession of a so-called large capacity magazine. Now, he challenged those charges and argued that the magazine ban itself violates the Second Amendment. And that argument is what ultimately brought this case on appeal and led to this new ruling. Now, here's where things in this case kind of got unusual. Originally, the United States prosecuted Benson and defended the magazine ban. But of course, during the appeal, when the Trump administration changed over, the federal government changed its position because the Trump administration took a very strong pro-2A stance. So I want to give them their kudos on that because they were advocates for the Second Amendment in this case. The United States actually conceded that the magazine ban violates the Second Amendment, so the federal government essentially told the court that we now agree that this law is unconstitutional. And that essentially left the District of Columbia, D.C. itself to step in to defend this ban. Because under the court's rules, the district here was allowed to intervene to continue defending this law after the federal government withdrew its support and actually joined the other side and supported striking down this ban. That alone made this case very unusual, but also a very interesting case. But the court's final ruling on this issue is what makes this decision very important and how it's going to impact all of these cases going forward. The DC Court of Appeals ultimately sided with Benson and the United States. They sided with the pro-2A side and struck down this ban. It ruled that the district's magazine ban violates the Second Amendment. And the court's reasoning follows the framework laid out by the Supreme Court in Heller and Bruen. And finally, we had a court faithfully apply Heller and Bruen the way that it's supposed to strike down these bans. Now, the court here made three key findings. First, the court said that magazines are in fact arms protected by the Second Amendment because they are essential components that allow modern firearms to actually function. Second, the court found that magazines holding more than 10 rounds are in common use and widespread across the entire country. The court noted that there are hundreds of millions of these magazines in circulation and that they also come standard with many of the most popular firearms that are sold today and possessed today as well. And under Supreme Court precedent, weapons that are commonly owned for lawful purposes cannot be banned outright. So there cannot be categorical ban on these types of arms. This is what led to the court's third main conclusion. They argued that there is no historical tradition of banning arms in common use, and because of that, the district's magazine ban violates the Constitution. So the court reversed Benson's convictions that were based on his possession of these magazines, and again, they reversed that ban on magazines in the district and essentially struck it down. Now, here's why this ruling matters far beyond what is going on in Washington, D.C., and far beyond just this single case. And that is because several federal appellate courts have actually reviewed this issue in the past and ruled in the opposite way. And this creates a very critical circuit split that we have been waiting for a long time. Most importantly, The Ninth Circuit in the Duncan versus Bonta case, which dealt with California's magazine ban, the Ninth Circuit en banc panel upheld that ban. They've reviewed that multiple times, and each time they uphold this magazine ban in California. In fact, in this very opinion written by the DC Court of Appeals, they tear apart the Ninth Circuit's Duncan ruling. They criticize it and say that the Ninth Circuit did not faithfully apply Heller or Bruin. The DC Court of Appeals says that these types of bans are unconstitutional because the magazines are in common use. Those two opposing conclusions of the DC Court of Appeals and the Ninth Circuit cannot both be right, and that is where this creates a critical circuit split between courts. Now let's talk about why a circuit split matters and how it changes things going forward, because this is kind of one of the first times that we've seen something like a circuit split develop around magazine bans. So a circuit split happens when different courts interpret the Constitution very differently. That means that the law is applied one way in part of the country and in a completely different way in another section of the country. And resolving these types of conflicts is one of the main reasons really, that the Supreme Court actually exists. When courts start to disagree about constitutional rights, the Supreme Court often steps in to settle that issue. And that also brings us directly to Duncan versus Bonta, which is pending currently in front of the Supreme Court. Duncan versus Bonta is a major challenge to California's ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. The Ninth Circuit upheld that ban in a controversial en banc panel ruling, and the plaintiffs in that case have already asked the Supreme Court to review that ruling. So right now, the Supreme Court has a case dealing with magazine bans pending in front of them, and it's been relisted multiple times for conference. Now that another court has ruled in the opposite way, the pressure is now on the Supreme Court to step in to address this issue, and really that pressure has increased significantly, far beyond what we've ever seen before dealing with this issue. Because now the Supreme Court has to deal with other courts reaching directly conflicting conclusions surrounding the Second Amendment and magazine bans. And historically, that is one of the strongest reasons that the court will actually grant review to these issues. Now, when it comes to the DC Court of Appeals ruling that we just got, procedurally, there are a few things that can happen going forward. First, the District of Columbia could ask the court here for a rehearing en banc. Second, the district essentially could go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court and file a cert petition asking for the court to review this decision on their own. I also want to note when it comes to the en banc panel review potential of this case, that is an option, like I mentioned, but I believe currently there are 2 vacancies when it comes to the en banc panel there, and the Trump, administration, Trump himself could fill those. So that would also swing the majority in our way. So that maybe is not a viable option. But even if this specific case doesn't reach the Supreme Court immediately, it could still influence what happens in Duncan, because now the justices on the Supreme Court are looking around at the nation and they're seeing growing conflict between courts when it comes to magazine bans. So what does this mean going forward? Well, this new ruling significantly strengthens the argument that the Supreme Court needs to resolve this magazine ban issue, because right now we have conflicting rulings involving California, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Washington, D.C. as well. And courts are deeply divided over whether those bans comply with the Second Amendment. That type of legal confusion is exactly what prompts the Supreme Court to finally intervene. Also, I will note that in other magazine ban challenges that are currently pending, and in also other two-way cases dealing with similar hardware ban issues, think suppressor bans or assault weapon bans, there will likely be 28J letters submitted to those courts and in those different cases pointing to this ruling now out of the DC Court of Appeals. That sends the impact and ripple from this ruling far beyond just magazine ban cases and far beyond just what is going on in DC. So stepping back, here is the big takeaway with this ruling. A court has now ruled that magazine bans violate the Second Amendment because these magazines are widely owned and commonly used. The federal government itself actually supported striking down this ban, and the ruling directly conflicts with what the Ninth Circuit has already said also in that Duncan versus Bonta case, which is pending in front of the Supreme Court. That conflict creates a circuit split between courts that significantly increases the chances that the Supreme Court will need to step in and also potentially grant review to Duncan or another case down the road, which means we may soon see the Supreme Court decide whether magazine bans nationwide are constitutional. So now we will wait to see how things play out from here. But because of this new ruling, we are in a pretty much unprecedented territory And honestly, my hopes are very high, a lot higher than they've ever been, that potentially we can get action from the Supreme Court and we will see more magazine bans actually fall because of this ruling. So that's where things currently stand. We will now wait anxiously to see potentially how the Supreme Court responds to this and also how other courts will respond to this new ruling. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.